Hello and welcome back to the It Depends Lessons in Technology Leadership podcast. I, as always, am your host. My name is Kevin Goldsmith. I've been in technology for almost 35 years, moving up from developer to manager to director to VP, and now for the last 10 years, CTO. And in this podcast, we talk about leadership in technology and the things you need to know to be a successful leader. We have a bit of a shorter episode this time. I've been in an offsite all week and I am exhausted. It was great spending time with my team, but it made it a little bit harder for me to put together a longer episode. I hope you don't mind something a little bit shorter, but I think I cover this pretty well. So you're not getting shorted on the insights. Today, I want to talk about having hard conversations. There's a lot of leadership writing about how to have them. There's much less about when to have them. The when is usually where it breaks. There's a specific kind of regret most experienced leaders have, even if they don't talk about it. It's not the regret of having said the wrong thing. It's the regret of not having said something earlier when the situation was still small enough that a small conversation could have changed it. For example, the senior engineer who should have been talked to before they took an offer somewhere else, a peer who should have been challenged on a pattern before it became a culture problem, the team that needed direct feedback before they decided you were absent on the thing that mattered most to them. The phrase that gives it away every time is some version of "I knew earlier," usually followed by some version of "I didn't have enough yet." That "I didn't have enough yet" is what we say when we mean "I didn't want to do this yet." So this episode is about that earlier, smaller, cheaper version of every difficult conversation, the one you almost talk yourself out of needing. And I've struggled with this myself and learned a lot from my own failures here, where I let situations go on longer than they needed to. I saw things going on that I thought maybe I should address, but wasn't sure it was my place, or didn't want to overstep, and so let things continue to develop that I really should have stepped in and put a stop to. So I'm speaking from experience here, and I'll give some specific examples a little bit later. The surface question is, when do you bring something up? The actual tension is between two costs that don't show up on the same time scale. The cost of being wrong is immediate and visible. You said something, the person was having a bad week, you damaged a relationship over what turned out to be nothing. I've done that. The cost of being right, but late, is delayed and diffused. The pattern hardens. The person adapts to the absence of feedback. The team makes up their own story about why nothing is being said. By the time the conversation is unavoidable, you're not having the conversation you wanted to have. You're managing the wreckage of having not had it. Most leaders are calibrated to avoid that first cost and to pay the second one. The second one looks more like the cost of leadership, and so it doesn't feel like a mistake. Most leaders are calibrated to avoid that cost of being immediately wrong, and they want to pay the second one, the cost of being right, but delayed and diffused. That second cost looks more like the cost of leadership, so it doesn't feel like a mistake. You want to say the data is never complete enough. That's not a problem to solve. It's a feature of the role. What's at stake is not just a specific situation, but the leader's relationship with their own judgment. Every time you let a pattern run past the point you noticed it, you're teaching yourself to discount your own signal. Now, when I was a manager at Adobe, I had a very senior person on my team. It was an amazing get to have hired him onto the team and just valued his experience and his knowledge. He'd been trying to push some needed architectural improvements to our platform, but he was hitting a lot of roadblocks within the team. Now, I agreed with the changes he wanted to make, but I didn't act proactively. The other developers were much more vocal about their priorities and always made it sound like an emergency. And I didn't have the maturity to challenge them, and I was avoiding the confrontation with them. This extremely senior developer wasn't argumentative, and so disappointing him was easier. He was very mellow, and he just went along. But he expressed his frustration in multiple one-on-ones, and I kept asking him to be patient and tried to refocus him on other work. He wasn't feeling like he was contributing in the way he knew he could. By the time I decided to prioritize some of the work he wanted to do, he told me that he'd taken an offer at another company where he could lead their architecture group. It was a big loss for our team. He just didn't feel like he was being heard. And he was telling me, I just didn't want to have the hard conversation with the other people on the team. And I lost a really good contributor because of that. It was a big loss for the team. A few years later at Spotify, one of the managers reporting to me was challenged with a developer who wasn't quite hitting the mark. The person would give feedback and improve for a while, but then go back on not being quite what we needed. I worked with the manager for a few months, coaching them on how to work with the developer, but they were avoiding having the hard conversation because they really hadn't done it before, and they kept telling themselves they were seeing little signs of improvement, and they wanted to be liked by everyone on their team. Eventually, I scheduled a one-on-one with the developer myself and had a very direct conversation with them about their performance, the specific areas they needed to improve, and the consequences of not making significant and permanent improvements. They thanked me for my honesty, and they made a concerted effort and performed significantly better for years afterward. If their manager had been open with them earlier, they could have avoided months of struggle where they didn't really understand why they weren't meeting the mark and what they needed to do to improve because their manager was avoiding the difficult conversation. I always like to give you a framework that you can use. This framework is the 5 signals to stop waiting. It's about when to stop telling yourself you don't have enough information. 5 signals. If 2 or more are present, the conversation's already overdue. The first signal is pattern, not incident. The same thing twice, with the same person or in the same situation. 1 occurrence is a data point, 2 is the start of a trend you're already discounting. Distance. You're hearing about it from somewhere other than the people involved, and the intensity of what you're hearing is going up rather than down. Secondhand information getting louder is a leading indicator that the person closest to it has lost confidence that direct routes work. The third signal is workarounds. You or somebody else has started routing around the person or the topic. The team has quietly redistributed something. A peer has stopped looping them in. You're choosing different agendas for your one-on-ones to avoid the area. The org is adjusting before anyone has said anything out loud. The fourth signal, cognitive load. You're spending real mental energy on the avoidance itself, not on the underlying issue. You're scripting your conversations in the shower. You're rehearsing it on walks. The thing the situation costs you has stopped being the situation itself and started being the management of it. The fifth signal is inflation. The version of the conversation you're rehearsing keeps getting bigger. 3 weeks ago was a casual check-in, now it's a serious sit-down. Soon you'll be thinking about whether HR should be in the room. The seriousness of what you're imagining is rising, even when the situation hasn't dramatically changed. That's a tell that your own waiting is now the major factor in how the conversation will go. The framework is a checklist for the moment you notice yourself hesitating. It doesn't tell you what to say. It tells you that the decision about whether to say something is already made, and you're just negotiating with yourself about the timing. When the conversation in your head is getting bigger and the situation isn't, the wait is the thing doing the damage. So what do you do when you've decided the conversation needs to happen? Lead with observation, not interpretation. I noticed X lands very differently from I'm worried you're Y. The observation can be discussed. The observation is fact. The interpretation feels like a verdict or an attack. Make the time deliberate but small. Not a calendar invite labeled feedback, not an ambush in the hallway. A brief, intentional opening that signals this is a conversation, not a performance review. Be specific about what you noticed and unspecific about what it means. The whole point of the earlier conversation is that you don't yet know what it means. That's why it's still cheap. And be willing to be wrong out loud. I might be reading this wrong, and if I am, tell me, because that's also useful information. Now, if some of this sounds like nonviolent communication, yeah, that's because I believe in nonviolent communication. If you haven't read that book, you should check that book out. Now, another reason not to let it go for too long, like saving it for your regular one-on-one next week. Not only does it now put time between the action and your feedback, but that timing kills it By the time your one-on-one comes up, you've reattached to the avoidance, and the conversation becomes a calendar item instead of a decision. Another failure mode, loading the conversation with everything you've been holding back. The earlier conversation is supposed to be one thing. If you're stacking up 6 months of accumulated observations, that's a different conversation. And the person on the other end will receive it as an attack rather than a check-in. Soft pedaling to the point where the person doesn't realize what you said. If the message can be missed, it will be. They will leave the conversation thinking it was a casual check-in. You will leave thinking you addressed it, and both of you will be wrong. This is something that I struggled with, which is why I put it here. I very much would have a conversation where I'd say, hey, I think it's about time that you might start thinking about how you're communicating with other people on your team. And I would just put it in all this wishy-washy language, because what I didn't want to say is, hey, you're really annoying everybody, and they don't listen to you anymore because you're so annoying. But that's what was happening. But instead, I put a bunch of caveats around it. What the person heard is, I could be more effective in my communication. I should think about that eventually, not like, I need to change something right now. I've gotten a lot better at it. I've had to. I would not be able to do my job if I couldn't tell people what they needed to hear. I'd be completely ineffective. So I have learned how to do that. But I catch myself all the time, especially written. I will write something down. I will look at it and say, this sounds like a suggestion for a consideration for a point in the future, as opposed to, hey, we need to do this right now, and I will rewrite it. A good place to look at your own communication here is exactly that. Go and look at what you just written and think, if I was somebody else, would I read this as, you need to go do this? Or would I read this as, you should think about the possibility of possibly considering doing this maybe if you feel like it. The last failure mode I want to talk about is routing it through HR or a formal process. It's actually a relationship conversation. The minute it becomes procedural, you've changed what conversation you're having and lost the version that was still recoverable. Most of the conversations I regret weren't the hard ones I had. They were the easier ones I kept postponing. That's 100%. I've had some exceptionally difficult conversations as a manager over the years. I don't regret any of those. People needed to hear what they needed to hear. The ones I regret are ones that became really difficult conversations because I waited too long. So let's talk about what makes this hard, why you want to avoid it. It feels disloyal to raise something around soft skills. It feels like questioning someone's competence over what you can barely articulate. Most leaders, especially newer ones, would rather be wrong about timing than risk being wrong about the read. So they choose silence and they call it patience. For the person on the other end, they almost always sense the avoidance. They see the workarounds. They notice the topic that doesn't come up. The silence is louder than the leader thinks it is, and the absence of feedback gets interpreted usually in the worst possible direction. If you've ever had to have a conversation with somebody on your team where they're noticing that people aren't including them and they're really upset about this because they think they should be included, that's people routing around them. They're noticing it and they're coming to you because they think they're being treated unfairly because you haven't had the conversation with them telling them that whatever they're doing is not making them more effective with the team. Another difficulty here and why people avoid this is the rest of the team. They're watching how the leader, you, handles ambiguity. If they see someone struggling and nothing visible happening, they will make up a story. And that story is rarely flattering to the leader, you. So if people see a problem and they see that you're not doing anything about it, they'll start deciding, well, that's because Kevin must be best friends with this person. And so he's not getting in the way of this person being a jerk to the rest of the team. They will try and figure out what's going on from their perspective, and they don't have the information. And so they'll invent it. That's just human nature. When the team starts adjusting around someone, your reputation is already adjusting too. They're already looking at you and thinking you're not doing your job, or you're choosing not to do your job. That human cost compounds. Each round of avoidance makes the next round easier to rationalize. After enough cycles, the leader is no longer avoiding a conversation, they're avoiding their own role. So earlier for me, my default was to wait. The reasoning sounded responsible. Get more data, give people the benefit of the doubt. Don't overreact. Don't be the manager who pounces on one bad episode or one bad week. I've had to learn to be more proactive, to not wait, to be wrong sometimes, but learn how to be wrong in a way that doesn't permanently damage relationships. I talked earlier about a specific situation when I was an engineering manager where I avoided a tough conversation and paid a price for it. A few episodes ago, I talked about a situation where I, as a CTO, made the same mistake. Different reasons, but I made the same mistake. So if you remember, or if you haven't heard that episode, it was my very first CTO job. A conflict was building between the engineering team and the product team around prioritization. This is very common in the industry. I hear from engineers when I give talks, they come up to me afterwards and they say, how do you get product to prioritize technical debt? And I give them a very serious answer. Turns out my teams were having the same problem a few years ago. The engineers kept raising serious technical debt. The product team kept prioritizing new features instead. Very common. Same tension was every planning cycle, and the engineers felt like they're flagging something real and getting overruled every time. Now, it wasn't a blow up. It was a slow grind. It was the kind of thing that looks survivable in any single meeting. What I noticed and what I told myself is that the CPO and I both saw it. We had a good working relationship and we both did the thing that felt responsible. We coached our own sides and told ourselves we were giving the teams room to work it out. What we were actually doing was giving the problem room to grow. Letting teams resolve their own conflicts is often the right call. The mistake was not noticing that this one had stopped resolving and started compounding. The running disagreement brewed and got worse over the course of a quarter while we waited for the teams to resolve it themselves. Eventually, it reached the CEO. Not through me, not through my product peer. Somebody from a different organization was in a meeting, saw the tension, saw the disagreement, and mentioned it to the CEO in passing and asked him why this was going on. In our next one-on-one, the CEO said to me, if it's getting to me, that means it's not being handled. And if it's not being handled, I'm going to feel obligated to step in. And I will do a worse job at this than either you or the chief product officer because I'm furthest from the work. The cost of waiting wasn't a number. It was my CEO doing a piece of my job in front of everyone who could see it. The harder cost, though, was with my own engineers. They had been raising this technical debt problem for a long time. They've been raising it to their manager, they've been raising it to their director, and then they've been raising it to me when it wasn't being solved. My silence taught them something. The person who was supposed to have their back on technical health was not visibly in the room on it. I was waiting on them or their manager to fix it. They were struggling and weren't making progress. When an engineer left a little while after things were resolved, he mentioned that this tension that took forever for him in his mind to fix as an example of why he started looking for a new role. The earlier version would have been small. A shared prioritization rule, an agreed on tech debt budget, one joint planning session with the CPO, cheap, slightly awkward. The version I actually had came after the CEO was already involved, with both teams dug in and a leader above me watching whether I could run my own organization. By the time it reached the CEO, the cheap version of the conversation was already gone. What I learned from this is that the CPO and I should have stepped in much earlier. We chose not to, and we let it go on too long. And it was never about having the perfect answer. It was about not letting the ball hit the floor. What's changed for me is the recognition that the data is rarely the bottleneck. The bottleneck is usually the willingness to be wrong out loud. Once you stop treating uncertainty as a reason to wait, the cost calculus inverts. The earlier conversation is almost always cheaper, even when you're wrong. The shift wasn't from wait to act fast. It was from wait until I'm sure to act when I notice. The shift wasn't from wait because this is a difficult conversation I'm hoping resolves itself so I don't have to act, to I should act now because it's going to be a much more difficult conversation if I wait much longer. I used to think I was being patient. Most of the time I was just being slow. I want to leave you with a couple thoughts. The core principle Performance management is something you do every week. Performance reviews are not the box you file at the end. The earlier, smaller conversation is the actual work. Everything else is documentation of what you should have addressed sooner. A test you can apply this week. Pick the 3 people or situations you've been quietly avoiding bringing something up about. For each one, run those 5 signals: pattern, distance, workaround, cognitive load, and inflation. If 2 or more are present, you're not waiting for the right moment, you've already missed it. The right move is to schedule the smaller version this week before it has to be the bigger one. The conversation before the conversation is the cheapest version. Every version after gets more expensive. Thank you. I hope this has been valuable information for you. I will see you next week in the newsletter. I will see you in 2 weeks back here on the podcast. Have a great week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.